Okay, so before we can get too much further in, we really need to stop and pause for a minute and remind ourselves about the regulation of the profession and what it means to be admitted to practice. Now, we spoke way back in week 1 or 2 about the difference between holding a practicing certificate and being admitted to practice. So I want to spend a little bit of time today actually making sure that you understand the process for admission. The reading that you've been asked to do focuses particularly on matters relating to the character of those who are seeking admission, the Wendy Bacon case, and also the character or being a fit and proper person for maintaining a practicing certificate. So it's clearly quite important, and those of you who take the time to have a look at the Law Institute Journal will see that there is always a section that has a summary of the cases where the Legal Practice Board and Commissioner have essentially challenged the right of a person to continue to hold a practicing certificate. And these concepts come up quite regularly. So before we really even get deeply into the idea of duties to the client, we need to consider what it means to be an appropriate person to hold that practicing certificate. So let's talk a little bit about the admission process. I could put some slides up and there will be a slide pack available to you, but I think the best place for you to really start is to go and have a look at the VLAB website. So I've got that here in front of me. So VLAB stands for Victorian Legal Admissions Board. Now clearly, even though we have a uniform law, you will be admitted presumably in Victoria. Now, you will be qualified to be admitted pretty much in every state in Australia once you have met that state's practical components, once you have your law degree. But even though we have this uniform law, we look at, there is a separate admissions board in each state, including in those states that have adopted the uniform law. Now, basically, the admissions procedure is well worth your while, spending a little bit of time working your way through what you're going to need to put together in order to make that application for admission. At this stage, you're really at the academic stage. So I can talk about this in a minute, but essentially this is why I keep hearing this language about the priestly 11 subjects. These are the compulsory academic requirements for admission generally, and you need to undertake one of those at a university that has been accredited by the board, and you can see, thank goodness, I hear you saying that your university has in fact been credited. So these are reviewed from time to time, but in fact one of the reasons why you are doing this subject right now is because ethics and professional responsibility fall within the requirements for the priestly 11. The other thing that you're going to need to do once you've actually finished your academic requirements is you're going to need to undertake practical legal training as well. And again, well, I tend to just refer to practical legal training, but technically there are 2 ways of doing that. PLT, practical legal training course, or supervised legal training. Where I really want to focus on today, because I think these things are really important ultimately to understanding how it is that we ultimately provide the duties to the client we can, is this question of suitability. So suitability to practice actually requires you to demonstrate that you are a person. So you are required to satisfy the board that you are a person of good fame and character, and that you are a fit and proper person. So it's suitable to practice law. These are actually still seen as 2 separate requirements. So you can be of good fame and character, but not fit to practice law because you have some impairment or otherwise. And you might have the impairment, so not be a fit and proper person, but or you might not have any impairment, I should say, but be considered to not have sufficient good fame or character. So let me flip, I'm just going to flip back to my PowerPoint so that we can talk about this in a bit more detail. Now, again, not going through it in any detail, and it is something that you should go through in detail, and the readings will require you to go through in detail. And to be perfectly frank, it's not at all unusual to have a question or an exam that goes in particular to the suitability matters in relation to the admission process. But ultimately understanding what bodies are relevant to the decision whether or not to admit you, what the process is to get admitted. Now that changes from time to time and is largely a documented process, a documentary process. The requirements in relation to suitability and how you satisfy those, and possibly most importantly in this context, the disclosure requirements will be absolutely key to you understanding what it is that you need to do when it comes to time for you actually getting admitted. So let's think about what these eligibility requirements are. There are three. You need to be at least 18 years old, hopefully. Well, some of you might not actually be there yet, but by the time you get to requesting admission, that should be fairly easy. You must have the approved academic qualifications. We just had a look on the website, and assuming that you get through this degree and that you complete all of the compulsory subjects, you should have the approved academic qualifications. And then you need to have satisfactorily completed an approved practical legal training exercise. So that could be supervised workplace training, or it could be PLT. Now, all of these criteria are common across all the Australian jurisdictions, but as I said, the actual process and the board, the court that you will apply to will be different depending on which state you're in. Now, we're going to stick with Victoria because we're assuming most of you are in Victoria, if not, well, in fact, all of you are in Victoria. This is a face-to-face course, and it is most likely that you'll be applying in Victoria. Now, one of the things that you're going to need to do as part of this process is to get that compliance certificate from VLAB. So again, working through the requirements for VLAB at the appropriate time is going to be very important. Slides, we're going to rip through them here because we already looked on the website. These are the requirements, those were the requirements for Priestley 11. All of them will be pretty familiar to you, and ethics and professional responsibility is why we are here today. We've spoken about this. Let's get on to the character statements. So essentially, when we're talking about character statements here, we're talking about this question of, are you a fit and proper person or not? Are you a person who is suitable, fit and proper, and of suitable character? Basically, you will be required to make statutory declarations to support your character, and in fact, others will be required to make those as well. Now, of course, this is yet another area where multiple areas of the law kind of collide, I guess. The kinds of disclosures that you are requested to make may in fact be the kinds of things that you do not wish the world to know about you. And so we end up in this situation where the courts are very reliant on you to be honest, open and complete with the declarations that you make, because it may well be that third parties, because of the way the privacy laws work and because you haven't made those disclosures to them, are not aware of the kinds of things that might trigger an obligation to disclose. And they can include disclosures that, again, quite personal things like physical impairments, mental illness, addiction, issues that, in fact, you may have some real issues talking about with somebody else. So these can be cordoned off, for want of a better word, into separate affidavits, so that those people that you don't want to have know about these things aren't necessarily privy to them. But nonetheless, you still have an obligation to disclose anything that's relevant. So how do you work out what's relevant? And only this year, there's been a significant update to the guidelines that are produced by VLAB, and I think that these are really, really useful, and I would strongly recommend that you have a look at them. So effectively, while I'm not looking at you as I'm moving through the screen here, but if we look at what these are, the purposes of these guidelines are to ensure that you are aware that the admitting authorities and the court, so VLAB is the admitting authority, the Supreme Court of Victoria will be the court that you are applying to for admission, both will place a duty squarely on you. So the onus will be squarely on you to disclose any matter that could influence its decision about whether you are currently of good faith and character and a fit and proper person. And when you do make a disclosure, you need to do so honestly and candidly and be full and frank in what you say, and to remind you that failure to do so, if subsequently discovered, can have, this is a word that lawyers do not use lightly, catastrophic consequences. So if you could be refused admission, you could be struck off the roll subsequently. Catastrophic. So I'm going to leave you to go through that in your good time. It's something you need to go through now for this course, but also have close at hand when you are actually making your application. It's absolutely going to be key to what you do. So here we go. Let's bring this up here. Okay, so suitability is relevant on an ongoing basis. So even though you won't be required to make the good faith and character declarations regularly, if something happens that affects your suitability to practice, they can in fact be grounds for suspending or cancelling a practicing certificate. And as I mentioned earlier, those of you who are LIV members, who get the link to the LIV journal every month, and by the way, just to remind you, LIV membership is free for students, and they have some great resources, including library resources that are frankly way more sophisticated than the law school library, or the library resources we have in our law school. So really worth doing. But anyway, I lose my track of thought here. If you're looking at your LIV journal, you will see that every month there is a summary of cases where somebody's suitability for practice has been questioned. So let's have a look at some of the cases. In the reading that you had, I think it's really worth looking at a solicitor and the Law Society of New South Wales. It's a 2004 case, and in that case, it went all the way to the High Court. It's pretty interesting, actually. So there was a solicitor who, 10 years after they were admitted to practice, was convicted on 4 counts of aggravated indecent assault on a person under 16. Essentially, these assaults were against his stepdaughters. Subsequently, 2 years later, he was convicted of more similar offence, and he didn't actually tell the Law Society of New South Wales about his convictions. The Law Society of New South Wales sought to have him struck off the roll, and the Court of Appeal in New South Wales actually upheld that. They said that effectively, people who commit aggravated assault against children who live in their house are not people that we think are appropriate as good and proper people to be lawyers. The High Court, however, reversed that decision. They considered a range of different things, including the amount of personal stress that he was under at the time of the offences and afterwards. They considered his remorse. They considered the fact that he had sought psychiatric treatment, that he had full support of a psychiatrist, that his children and his partner had allegedly forgiven him, and that there was evidence that there was a continuing relationship. The biggest part, and your textbooks will go into this in a little bit more detail, really the biggest issue here is that the offences had nothing to do with his conduct as a solicitor. I find this a really difficult case because we're not, and we never have said that fit and proper person means a person who is good at being a lawyer. Fit and proper person has always gone to fame, the question of fame and character. And the crime that this person was not alleged with, but actually convicted of and was remorseful for, was something that I'm pretty sure all of us would consider to be a heinous one. And so I find it a really difficult question, and it is something that when you look at the case law, you will see that once somebody is admitted, the profession itself is very reluctant, and because remember, we're talking about self-regulation here. I mean, a court decides whether a person who owes a duty to the court can or cannot continue to practice their trade. And so we really are talking about insiders judging insiders in this context, and I think we need to be very aware of that. I think we're seeing a shift, particularly with crimes involving mental health, where we're seeing that where there is action that the person is taking to monitor and ensure that they remain of mental good health, that they deal with the symptoms of mental ill health. We're seeing that that's being dealt with in a way that I'm hoping most of us would consider as appropriate, treating mental health issues as health issues and not as character issues. But when we're talking about crimes of violence and sexual assault, really these are things that I personally consider go to good fame and character. Now, those of you who really align with the zealous advocate may feel very, very differently to me about that, and absolutely that's okay. The purpose of thinking about this is to think about, well, how does this stand with me and what does it mean to be a person of good fame and character? But let's talk about some of the cases now that deal with the question of who gets admitted. So one of the oldest ones that comes up over and over again is this case of Rei Davis, 1947. So Mr. Davis, who I believe actually studied to become a lawyer while he was in prison, actually managed to fail to disclose a conviction for breaking and entering and stealing, and it was made 8 years before the application for his admission. So, as it says here, despite the fact that the original offence had occurred in unusual circumstances and at a time of great personal hardship, the court found that his lack of candour in disclosing the offence was a bar to admission. Ultimately, it took another 32 years before he could get admitted. And I guess this is the starting point for the advice that you're going to hear over and over and over again, not just from me, not just from your tutor, but from everybody that you speak to, is if in doubt, disclose it. So when it comes to making your admission application, when we look at the cases, it is quite clear that the question of have you been honest, transparent, fulsome in your disclosure really impacts whether or not you will be granted that permission. Another one here, Rei Hampton in 2002, where the applicant for admission failed to disclose a disciplinary finding of inappropriate conduct in a previous employment as a nurse. So this was held to warrant refusal of admission because the court found, in addition to the lack of candour, see that word again, in failing to disclose the matter, the past behaviour showed a lack of appropriate professional judgment. Again, reasonably, it's a 20-year-old case, but well and truly worth having a look at. So in recent years, what we're seeing too is, and this is specifically dealt with in the guidelines, so look at it very carefully, is an increased interest by the court and the admitting bodies in matters relating to academic conduct. Now, I know you were told this on your first day, and one of the reasons, there are many reasons for you to ensure that you don't plagiarise and that you have academic integrity. Many more reasons than this. But at the end of the day, if you are accused of an issue relating to academic integrity, it doesn't matter whether you are successful or not. if an accusation is made, you are required to disclose that to the board. It's one of the reasons why we take it very, very seriously, and we do not lightly make accusations, because we know that you are going to have to disclose it. So the uniform law, or the uniform admission rules now, require specific disclosure of any adverse findings, but disclosing adverse or otherwise becomes a requirement under the guidelines. So key case here is Rei OG. There's a summary on the slide. I'm not going to go through it in any detail. What is really important here is to understand that failure to disclose the fact of an accusation, the fact that there was a hearing in relation to a matter, is understood by the courts and VLAB to be a lack of candour and a lack of recognition of the seriousness and the potential impact on one's reputation. So disclose, 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 disclose. Application by Saunders is another really good example of one where you exactly the same kind of issue, but it's one that can come up quite often, particularly following out of the robo-debt scandal of a couple of years ago. If you end up having an issue with Centrelink, particularly in relation to a request for repayment, if Centrelink is of the view that you have been paid too much, that your balance of work and study hasn't been quite right, happens a lot. There is no shame in it as far as I'm concerned. These things, people work flexibly, the rules change regularly and situations change regularly. But if you are, I'm going to use a strong word, accused of overpayment by Centrelink, even if and when you sort it all out and you are perfectly in the right, you need to disclose it. And Saunders is a really good example of where that happens. Your case book, or the reading, actually looks at the Wendy Bacon case, which I think is particularly interesting. And one of the things I'd like you to think about when you're looking at the Wendy Bacon case, or Rei B as it's referred to, is the question is, do you think that Ms. Bacon would be refused admission today? Essentially, the particular case, now Miss Bacon was a very, let's call it, prominent dissident at the time. She was very much involved in the student movement. She was studying law. She was involved in the publication of something called the Little Red Book, which was effectively a sex education handbook that was designed for high school students in the 1970s, at a time when access to literature about sexuality for children was really very limited, if it existed at all. It was seen as a very an outrageous, even immoral thing. There were huge protests around the availability of this text. There were a number of different protests that happened, and she was involved in them, including in one where she was asked to give evidence in relation to a particular circumstance, and it was later found that she misled the court in relation to whether or not bail had been forthcoming in relation to another protester. Ultimately, when she finished her law degree and she applied for admission, she was rejected. There are a number of different issues that this has raised. In particular, we can point to particularly her lack of candour and the fact that she told a lie under oath is the thing that the Law Society really held on to when refusing her admission. And frankly, my view is if that were to happen today in relation to that issue, she would probably be refused admission again, particularly if she didn't disclose and if she didn't show any remorse. So even if she had committed a crime before she got to the point of admission, and perjury is a crime, as you know, even if she'd committed a crime, you can still get admitted. You just need to demonstrate that you understand that it was a crime, that you have remorse, that your character, there's been some change to your character since you committed that crime, or that there were circumstances at the time that meant you didn't understand, or that there was some reason at the time. And the fact that you've disclosed it goes a long way to showing that integrity and good character. So that's quite important. Here, my memory is in Rei B that Miss Bacon did, in fact, make that disclosure. Sorry, I'll pop these things on the I'll pop some additional things on the slide while I was thinking out loud. One of the things that really appeared to be a significant issue at the time was her political activities, and effectively that she was seen by the court as being, I don't think there's any other word for it, a bit of a rat bag. It's really interesting because Winnie Bacon actually was never admitted. She stopped trying after a little while. She ended up being a professor of journalism at UTS and a really respected feminist and author, effectively. Clearly, she remained pretty left-wing for most of her life. But the question of whether or not she gained respect for the law and the legal process over time, it's never really been answered. And really, that's one of the questions that we really need to think about as we look at how the law works. What happens if you change your views? How does this impact our thinking? So with those things in mind, I want you to read that chapter from Parker and Evans, which is going to do a couple of things for you. It's going to give you a fairly high-level overview of the way that the profession is regulated, and the circumstances in which action gets taken by the relevant boards. So in the case of Victoria, that would be the Legal Practice Board and Commissioner, to suspend or cancel a practicing certificate. But most relevantly for you, what the process will be for you to become admitted, and what kind of things you're going to need to think about when you put together your application for admission. And really, the one message over and over and over again is disclose, disclose, disclose. So have a look also at the guidelines from VLAB, and even though it's quite a long way off for most of you, that application process, stopping and actually thinking, okay, what is it that I might need to disclose, and how do I do that, and what is that process going to look like for me? Forewarned is forearmed, and making sure that you're in a position to demonstrate that you are of good and proper character, and what being of good and proper character means, and being a person who is fit to practice will be a really important part of your journey. So that's all I've got for you right now, and when we do the next one, we'll be talking about the duties to the client. At last, you say.